Good evening, everybody. It is I, Nick, Pennsylvania, and I am here, as always, with my friend Brendan Bond.
Hey everybody, how's it going, Nick?
Doing real good. Happy to be here with you this evening. Now, the past few times we've gotten together, it's been me bringing stuff to the conversation, and Brendan's been out, and he's dug up a couple stories, one fairly short, a little more involved, getting into some of the histories. He had me digging up newspaper articles from 70 odd years back. It's what I do. It's my gift. And I actually have to confess, I haven't read the article, but I did find the one that you were hoping I would find. And so we're going to get into a couple stories that Brendan has brought today. Both of them take place in northern central Pennsylvania area. And one of them takes place, my father has a fly fishing cabin less than 3 miles from the epicenter of the story. So really eager to get into that one. And so without any further ramblings on my behalf, I'm going to hand it over to Brendan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. Obviously, it's the spooky season. I have some articles and things that I've been thinking about talking with all of you about, but a lot of them are kind of weird, not so much spooky. So I wanted to find something for this week that really kind of, felt, Halloween-y. I was lucky enough that my brother sent me an article, was kind of fit the bill. And as per usual, that started me down a pretty serious, deep rabbit hole. So just to kind of give credit where credit is due first, this article is by a gentleman named Lou Bernard, who, after reading some of this stuff, I'm definitely going to be looking up because he is definitely still an active author and writer out near Lock Haven, apparently. But this first article was published on the PA Wilds blog, which is actually really great for all the PA Wilds, like marketing and cultural stuff. Anyone that's into those things, they're really on point. They have some really, really fun articles and resources over there. So this article was about something that I had never heard of before, but obviously piqued my interest. And the article was about a place called the Crybaby Cemetery. And so I read that and was like, well, this this checks all the boxes, because we've talked about cemeteries many times before, and how despite it not being a very reasonable thing that they're haunted, they are in fact the subject of lots of stories.
Well, and I was intrigued by the name too, because of course we hear Crybaby Bridge, and we both know that that is one of those things that many towns of consequence will have a story that essentially is a crybaby bridge of a kind.
Right.
But this is a cemetery, huh?
Right. Crybaby. I've heard lots of crybaby bridges and crybaby roads, crybaby bend, crybaby creek. I believe we even talked to Thomas White. I believe he mentioned that whenever he was on. And so, yeah,
Indeed, we did.
Yeah. So it's one of those things that immediately you're like, okay, I know what I'm in for. And as per usual, when I think I know where something is going, it goes in a different direction. So, but just so real quick, so the cemetery we're talking about is in fact a real place. While doing a little bit of research on it, I was able to find it on Find a Grave, a website that we're on relatively often for one reason or another. And it is St. Luke's Cemetery in Salem Township in Clarion County. Now, this is right southwest of Knox a little bit. So north of 80, south of Knox. A few places that I found online said that this was possibly also called St. Paul's Cemetery, or Pickwick Cemetery, or Triangle Cemetery. It seems like by looking at the non-article related resources that it's probably called St. Luke's Cemetery, but it is on, in fact, Triangle Road. I think that's where the Triangle Cemetery comes from. It's a pretty small cemetery, and it looks like it might be shared by a few churches. Some of the earliest gravestones that I saw on Find a Grave date back to the 1870s, with people being born in the early 1800s. I didn't see any 1700s folks. But so, for this area, not an unusually old cemetery, but certainly would fit the bill for being an old cemetery that probably has some lore and, some legitimate history in the area. Because again, as we've talked about so many times, what that area of this of Pennsylvania looks like right now versus how it looked in the 1870s, very different. So so just I think it's an interesting place that might not be very assuming initially until you kind of dig in. So I found a few articles in addition to this one by Lou Bernard that I mentioned, and all of them seem to pretty much have the same set of phenomena reported. We hear a lot in cemeteries, but the two biggest ones were the feeling of being watched, which, we hear often, and then children laughing, which kind of unsettling. It's an understandable thing to be kind of thrown by. You should not hear children laughing in a rural cemetery.
Well, and I hate to jump the gun real
Go for it.
quick, but was there like a playground or a school in the woods on the other side of the cemetery?
Not looking on Google Maps, it looks like it is kind of near a
It's
Reformed and Lutheran church, or a Reformed
and
Lutheran church.
it's not like it's not too far from a grocery store either. That's kind of a rural grocery store,
Right.
the Smart Shopper there.
Yeah. So it's out there a
Okay.
bit, but it's definitely not like in the middle of the woods a
And the only
mile from
reason I
nothing.
asked that is because as soon as you start talking about the children laughing, I remember tales of another haunted cemetery where there's like a playground in the woods that is very much there. It's just it's
Mm-hmm.
broken down, it's been neglected, but it used to be part of a school that's no longer there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, all right, I
So yeah,
apologize for
certainly, yeah,
interrupting.
no, but I think anytime you hear stuff like that, I think it's important to think like, okay, are there any possible mundane explanations? Because if you don't know there's a playground, 300 yards away and through the woods into an opening, then yeah, you're going to hear children laughing. It appears that in addition to this, the reason apparently that you hear children laughing is kind of a sad story. Obviously, at this time there were, especially in the early 1900s, there were a lot of deaths due to different illnesses and sicknesses and things like that. And apparently there were two twins that died, and due to a mix-up were accidentally buried on opposite ends of the cemetery, so not like near each other. And folks say that the crying that you hear is actually them trying to call out to each other, which is sad and very spooky. Again, I looked on Find a Grave, didn't see any twins listed that I could find. But again, there was a lot of similar names. You see the same name listed a bunch of times. So it is possible that there is a grain of truth there, but I couldn't find it. Now, additionally to that, there's two other, I think, kind of weirder, if children laughing and crying isn't enough, weirder phenomena. One is that apparently the graves will bleed sometimes.
All right, that is a new one.
That's a new one. I've never heard of bleeding graves, which, like, part of me thinks like, okay, what kind of rocks are they using? Is it there's some kind of sediment or whatever? But I feel like if people are saying they're bleeding, like, you're not going to confuse lichen for blood.
Well, we've heard of bleeding statues and crying statues. As
Right.
I recall, in Pittsburgh, there was
Well,
a
yes.
crying statue of Mary or something.
Yeah, and I think usually when you hear about crying or bleeding statues, it's, at least off the top of my head, it seems to be more related to like faith-based things, like Marian apparitions or miracles. But so just straight up bleeding headstones, that was definitely a new one. And then this thing I thought was just interesting because it seems like too weird to make up, but again, probably has a mundane explanation. There is a monument apparently in the graveyard that is one of those like obelisks that has like a ball on top, and which is like a common sight in most cemeteries. But apparently, this ball would fall off and be found at random places in the cemetery, and that freaked people out. And again, that's all kind of down to, I think, like the credibility of the story, not credibility, but the situation of the storytelling, because kids and ne'er-do-wells will screw around with things at cemeteries. But it seems like how these articles were written is that it happened often enough that like a groundskeeper just eventually took the ball away instead of like securing it differently, which was just like one of those things. Again, and this might be a case of it showing up once in one story in lots of places, reprinting that. We run into that quite often. I thought that was an interesting addition to the phenomena. So graves being, somehow changing. So again, like, that was the first article I came across. just really enjoyed it because I thought it was different. It wasn't what I expected. Because again, when you hear Crybaby Cemetery, I think like, okay, it's just going to be, some noises and there's not going to be anything else to it. It's just like a spooky place. But the fact that this had the lore about the twins being buried, which is again a sad but kind of a spooky story, and then the bleeding graves, which is kind of dramatic, but again showed up in a few different articles, and then this ball falling off of a monument and showing up in different places in the cemetery. I mean, again, I'd like to see that. I'd like to see how big that thing was. Because if it's small, like, yeah, like kids screwing around could probably do that. But I mean, I'm sure, Nick, you've seen, and other people have, sometimes those monuments are huge and, a 2-foot granite ball would probably weigh a few hundred pounds, would not go from one side of the cemetery to the other without some serious help. So yeah, that's kind of the quick story of Crybaby Cemetery outside of Clarion, close to Knox, PA.
Yeah, and I can't believe I asked the question earlier about the playground and everything, only because you did tell me where this was, and I realize that I'm almost certain that this is where, right outside the cemetery proper, there was a man that killed his wife and stepdaughter and then killed himself. This would have been around 1915, I imagine, and they dragged his body behind a wagon and buried him outside of the cemetery proper. And I think I've talked about this in a previous episode. If not, I know I've talked to you about it. There is a tradition among some of the family members that goes to this day, apparently, to urinate on the rock that marks this man's body.
Right.
Same cemetery.
Pretty wild. Yeah.
Pretty wild. So it does make me wonder when this myth started, and if it's just kind of the knowledge that, oh, there's some nasty people in that cemetery or whatnot. And
if things just kind of compound, and again, like we've said before, if you assume a place is haunted, it is very likely that there are in fact some stories related to it for one reason or another.
Well, it is a spooky season, and I know a lot of people associate that with the tailing of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. You have a headless fellow of another color, eh?
Yes. So this is the one we were kind of teasing a little bit earlier. So when I read that first article, I was like, oh, I want to see, as a lot of us do, when you read one thing by an author that you enjoy, you seek out other publications. And I found another article that this gentleman had written that was titled "The Dark Skies Ghost." And I was like, well, you got me. Like, I'm in. So I started reading this article. Very quickly, I was like, I feel like I've heard this story before, but wasn't sure where. So I do have quite a few notes and thoughts about this article. But again, I wasn't able to find the source article that Nick was able to dig up. We both do a lot of looking for those things. Nick is considerably better at finding them than I am. But just to kind of give a quick overview of where this article came from. So there was a gentleman named Hiram Cranmer, who was the postmaster in Leidy Township in Clinton County back in the 1950s, which was an area that I really like. Nick, you were saying your father has a hunting camp, or excuse me, a fly fishing camp.
Yeah,
up there.
I suppose you could hunt from it. Yeah,
you could. You could.
It's located right along. Well, there's Cross Fork Creek and Elk Lick, and it's near the confluence of those two. There's quite a few cabins back that way. People from outside the region, if they know this immediate area for anything, it's most likely for, I think it's called Cherry Hill.
Yeah, Cherry Springs.
This is right. There is so. This is one of the things that blows my mind, because we are in Atlantic state, Pennsylvania. This region of Pennsylvania, you've heard me say it before, wasn't fully mapped out until the 1920s. And to this day, it's pretty remote. It might be difficult for some people to come to terms with that, especially people, like if you're out in Oklahoma or that southeastern corner of Colorado, you know what remote is. And it's not quite that dramatic, but bottom line is there's so little light pollution in this north central region of Pennsylvania that there is a plateau on one of these Alleghenies, and there is a dark park. I believe it's called Cherry Hill. And with the naked eye, it is just astounding how much you can see. And when I talk to people from outside the immediate area, that's one of the things that a lot of people seem to be aware of. That and the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon, that's the other thing. But yes, so there's 3 creeks. There's the Cross Fork, Elk Lick, and then there's Kettle Creek, which is the larger of the 3. And then that goes into feeds down into Austin, which fed the dam, which was the site of the second most devastating dam disaster in Pennsylvania. First is Johnstown, second is Austin.
Yep.
About 30 years later. And then it goes into, I think, the Little Fork of the Cinemahoning before going into the Susquehanna River.
Right. And Cherry Springs State Park is up on the hill you were mentioning. And
Thank you. Cherry Springs, not Cherry Hill.
It's I think the hill's park on Cherry Hill, but it's Cherry Springs State Park. And but I've been up there a bunch of times. That's an area that my family goes to relatively often, right off of the first fork of the Cinemahoning Creek. It's a wonderful area. And you're mentioning how dark it is up there, where the name of this ghost comes from. Little fun fact: darkness for the sky is rated on something called the Bortle scale, and it is 9 through 1, 9 being like an inner city sky, like there's lots of skyscrapers around as far as light pollution goes. 1 is like a
cave.
It's like
I guess it can't be that dark because we're rating the outside darkness.
But Cherry Springs is a 2, which is one of the darkest places on the East Coast. It's very hard to find somewhere that has a night sky that's as bright as this area. If you ever get a chance to get up there, it's wild. If you have a clear night, you can see the Milky Way in a way with the naked eye that is like really, really kind of wild. Like you don't expect it until you see it. It's really kind of out there.
Even if you're not in Cherry Springs, I know the last time I was up at the camp was a few years ago. My wife and I were coming back from the region, the foothills of the Adirondacks up in New York, and we were just going to camp there for the night because it was a long drive. The joke there is, because it's wedged in this holler, it's this very narrow valley. The joke there is that the sun rises about 11 in the morning and sets at about 3 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
It was something like 4 on a July day, and she was freaked out.
Right.
We ended up leaving. I ended up having to get in the car and driving, and I don't think we got out of the car until about 3 in the morning. It was awful. We ate and left.
Yeah. No, it's a wild place. It's in the middle of nowhere. Like the largest area near there is Cloudersport, which has a Sheetz now. It's coming up in the world.
They've had the Sheetz, Brendan. I'll have you know. But Cloudersport is where Elliot Ness, the untouchable Elliot Ness, died, and I think Cloudersport is a couple thousand people there.
Yeah, it's not nothing, but it would be a blip out in most other places.
Honest to goodness, any community with more than 150 people in Potter or
that
Clinton
area
County. Cloudersport is the county seat of Potter County.
Right.
Anywhere that has more than 150 people is a town of real consequence.
Right. Seriously. Yeah. I mean, I know it sounds like we're being hyperbolic here, but like we're not. But yeah. So this is the area we're speaking about, where Hiram Cranmer is from, and so he was someone who was kind of locally and regionally known as kind of an early folklorist. Turns out he wrote a book that I'm trying to find. I haven't found it yet. It's called 2 Penny Ballads and $4 Whiskey, a Pennsylvania folklore. I can't pronounce the next word. It's in parentheses, King Arthur's Tomb, told by Hiram Cranmer. So he was someone who was known to be a local folklorist and kind of telling a lot of stories. Probably the kind of gentleman we would be hanging out with.
We should have a seance to interview him or something.
That's a great idea. But again, he was a postmaster, so it wasn't like he was just someone stuck in a cave somewhere. He was, known in town. So as a result, there were 2 reporters, Pete Stevenson and and a guy named Jim Patterson, who were from Lock Haven, the Lock Haven Express paper specifically, and they came up to the area to interview him, and he told them this story about a headless ghost. So this is so we're now I'm gonna have Nick read the article. It's not terribly long, but this is the one I was looking for that he was able to find. So I want to give you guys this article first for context till we get into the rest of the conversation here.
Yeah, okay, so this, I found it in the Reading Eagle, in Reading, Pennsylvania, on August 17th, 1950. Now, I will say that Brendan was hoping to find the Lock Haven edition, but this story was actually printed in a number of papers going at least as far west as Michigan. So I'm going to read it in its entirety. As Brendan said, it's not terribly long. So, title, Ghost of Headless Frenchman Still Exists. Well, maybe. Lock Haven, Lock Haven, August 17th. So you don't believe in ghosts? Well, maybe that's because you don't live near Road Hollow. For the headless Frenchman of Kettle Creek still roams the wilds in these parts. At least that's what the folks of Clinton County say, and a reporter and photographer for the Lock Haven Express, who checked the authenticity of the legend, aren't saying yes or no. Legend has it that the ghost belongs to a French explorer who robbed a secret cave of Indian silver some centuries ago. The Indians, it seemed, avenged their loss by beheading the Frenchman when he returned for more silver. Reporter Pete Stevenson and photographer Jim Patterson, acting on instructions from High Cranmer, postmaster of the hamlet of Hammersley Fork, set out to track down the ghost. On a chilly, misty night, they parked their car near the bridge spanning Kettle Creek at Road Hollow. As they sat waiting, the only sound filling the night air was that of a distant pounding of a gas well drill working the night shift. Suddenly, a flickering, wavering form reared up less than 100 feet away. They edged toward the eerie reddish-white figure for a better look. A sound like that of a low, almost painful moan could be heard. The figure glided away, up the bank onto Road Hollow. It moved quickly in a faint moonlight. They ran to keep it in sight. A metal film holder fell from Patterson's pocket. They stopped to pick it up, and when they looked up again, the headless Frenchman was gone. Some say the Frenchman still roams the wilds of Clinton County looking for his head. Others say that he's angry because wildcatters are drilling for gas. As one Valley resident put it, it's his life blood, that natural gas, and these drillers are eating it all up. If they keep piping the gas out, the headless Frenchman will die. Some scientifically inclined folks scoff at the legend. They say that the moan is nothing but methane gas seeping from crevices. A forest ranger offered the suggestion that the eerie ghost-like figure is caused by glowing phosphorus clinging to moss and rotten logs in the damp woods. And then there's the story of the silver. Woodsman Harry Walters showed Stevenson and Patterson a piece of silver the size of a golf ball. He said he found it in the woods, and there's a lot more of the Indian silver around, he said. Disbelievers have an answer for that, too. They suggest some manner of ore which has become silverized over the years. Maybe so, and then again, maybe not. So, that is the article, again, from August 17th, 1950, 73 odd years ago, and I want to say just a couple quick things on top of that. I know you're going to get into some stuff, so I'm not going to debunk too much right now. But again, I mentioned my dad is a hydrogeologist, very familiar with that area. They talk wildcatters this way, I will explain, is a term that was coined in Western Pennsylvania. Of course, we were the birthplace of the oil boom and everything with Drake's Well out in Titusville. Wildcatters, I'm trying to remember the specific definition, but they were kind of like the rogue people that would set up operations, and they would make risky endeavors, or they would be kind of like squatting on the land and whatnot. I did want to say that I remember going out there with my dad, though, and he said that the largest compression station in the world.
Hmm.
I don't know if it still is, but it was. It's right in that area. So
Hmm.
part of me wonders if that was the start of that operation. And also, because as a geologist, I had to ask him about the silver. He says that there were stories of Shawnee taking white settlers as people to work in their mines, but then he said, no, the Shawnee were in Ohio. Check on the Iroquois Nation. But according to him, the southern tier of New York and the northern tier of Pennsylvania are not really well known for their massive silver deposits.
Right.
So I'll hand it over to you, but that is the article from 1950.
Yeah, no, that's all well said. The article that Lou Bernard published says that additionally to that article, originally in the Lock Haven Express, apparently after this sighting and everything, both Patterson and Stevenson went back to town. And once they kind of like calmed down and kind of got their bearings, talking about how incredible this situation was, Patterson pointed out that the story was going to be useless because nobody was going to believe them. However, one of them being a photographer, Patterson, which again, Patterson Gimlin film, this is kind of interesting. I just thought about that. But anyway, Patterson, being a photographer, said they should go back and try and get a photo of the ghost, which I give them a lot of credit for. You don't hear about that happening too often in most paranormal stories. So they go back, and according to them, the ghost was still there. It apparently groaned a low and mournful groan, and it raised its two arms towards them in a threatening manner. When it was doing this, Patterson took out his camera, which had a flash on it at the time, and took this photo. And apparently the ghost screamed a terrible scream and disappeared into the woods. I was able to find a photo from this time, and it just says "ghost caught by photograph." It talks about the ghostly outline and everything near Kettle Creek, Hammersley Fork, as Nick mentioned. Now, I showed Nick the photo earlier. I'm going to post it on our Instagram. So if you don't follow us on Instagram or Facebook, please do. You'll be able to see this photo. It's supposed to be a headless.
If you weren't before, that's the way to sell
this is if nothing else has got you so far, this picture of a headless ghost. Again, as someone who is a photographer and also really into this stuff, I love the idea of taking photos of ghosts. This looks like some painted squiggly lines on a negative.
It looked kind of to me like someone took a sheet and cut a headless people figure out of it.
Right. That's very likely. There's no depth to it, so it could be a sheet. It's a spooky photograph, but you guys can be the judge.
Now I know we're listening. This is a listening show, but would you pull that on the screen again for me?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, and my father just sent a text because I asked about that compression station to make sure, and all he said is the most secure and sealed, largest geographic spread is at Oakford in Murraysville. It sounds like some sort of I'm not totally understanding what he's saying there, but I thought I'd read it all the same.
No, that's to our geology enthusiasts out there, that probably rings true.
So does this even look like night to you?
It doesn't look like night. I mean, there's apparently a flash. And again, if there was a full moon, maybe, because I mean,
because I'm looking in the trees. Obviously, the trees are bare, and you can see sky. Now, okay, you tell me what I'm wrong about if I am, because I am not a photographer. But my assumption would be that a photo taken at night, even with a flash, it is not going to show that much detail between the trunks of the trees.
Right.
There. That's just what I'm guessing.
It does not look like a photo taken at night with a flash.
This is towards the end of the brush heap era. So these trees are not trees. They're large saplings.
Right. Yeah. Trees is a generous term. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's cool. Like again, I love the vibe of it, but
oh, for sure. No argument there.
But again, not convinced that it is in fact a headless ghost in this photo.
It actually kind of looks like a Texas Longhorn blowing steam. You see the
Oh, you're
outstretched
right.
arm?
Yeah,
See
that's
what
actually
he's picking
okay.
up what I'm
Okay.
saying there?
Okay. No, that's actually I see that immediately.
So
I'm
it's not a headless phantom. It
a
is just
headless
a headed phantom. There's
but
a bodiless phantom blowing steam.
yeah, but so yeah, if you want to see that photo, either Google it or feel free to check out our Instagram or
If
Facebook.
this conversation so far hasn't intrigued you enough to look us up there, and that's Brendan that curates all that. I am not on the gram as
Yeah.
the children call it.
but
But there
but
you
yeah,
are.
so and again, while reading this the original article that I found, partway through, as soon as I heard the word, headless ghost, I thought to myself, I feel like I've heard this story before, but it wasn't like, it was just like ringing a bell. And I'm like, wasn't sure if it was just me kind of thinking like, oh, this is just such a common story or something. But through a little bit more digging, was able to find that our if you were playing Ghost Furnace Bingo, you'd be checking this box. This was written about by Henry Shoemaker in PA Mountain Stories, which we've talked about on more than a few occasions. I was mentioning Nick earlier, I cannot seem to find my copy of PA Mountain Stories, so I ordered a new one because I'm going to need it in the future. But it did still ring a bell. I'm like, oh yeah, this is a Shoemaker story. As per usual, the origin is different with Shoemaker. But from what I remember, the ghost was the same, but the origin was different. Whereas the Patterson and Stevenson article mentioned it was a Frenchman who was stealing silver that was killed. The Shoemaker story relates a story about another Frenchman who was actually beheaded. Let me see what I found here. A gentleman named Gaston Bouchon, who was a soldier in the French army, and this was at a fort called a place called Altar Rock, which is again in Clinton County, same area.
Very real place, Altar
Very real
Rock.
place, yeah. For one reason or another, the fort was attacked. What I found was the Susquehannock Indians during like their escape as they're heading down river and everything. I assume Bouchon was wounded and everything, and was eventually killed by some Native Americans, and that is the origin of this ghost. And again, there's so much like French history in that area that not surprised that it's oh, there isn't? I thought, so were they further west? I thought they were that far east.
No. Okay, no, there actually is not much anything French that far east. Anything, so through the central region of Pennsylvania, of course, we have the Appalachians. Well, we're, okay, real quick. The only state that is entirely encompassed within the Appalachian region is West Virginia, but the state with the most of the Appalachian region is Pennsylvania by acreage, and the Allegheny Mountains kind of are part of the Appalachian Range, and they go through the central part of the Commonwealth. The French were really disposed of 4 forts that make up what is now the I-79 corridor.
Right,
so if you look at Route 79, there's starting in where Pittsburgh is now located at the confluence of the 3 rivers, there's Fort Duquesne. Mm-hmm. Most people, if you know of anything of French forts in PA, you're familiar with Fort Duquesne, or at least named Duquesne because of the college. Mm-hmm. Going further north, there was Fort Moshow, mm-hmm. which is in what's now Franklin, PA. In fact, mm-hmm. My friend and coworker Danielle lives about a block to a block and a half away from the remnants of the mm-hmm. fort. Going further up, mm-hmm. as you get into the town of LeBoeuf, there was Fort LeBoeuf Fort Beef. Mm-hmm. And then you finally get to Presque Isle in mm-hmm. Erie, Pennsylvania. It was Fort Presque Isle. Mm-hmm. Those were the 4 forts. I was looking. I have no evidence, no historical evidence of there being any other French forts in the region. Now, there was one French settlement that was established during the French Revolution, and that's French Azalom, which is out more towards the Lock Haven, Williamsport area. We've talked about that in one of our Dr. Pennsylvania things. But no, there was no real French establishment. And even when the forts in the West were maintained by the French, there was no real French settling in this area. Most of that occurred
fur
further
traders
north.
and yeah,
Right.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, you had folks in the area and had explorers and stuff like that. But no, yeah, because that's as soon as I was reading that, I was like,
Because, when you were telling me about this and I was doing a little bit of digging, one of my frustrations with Shoemaker, we know the accusations have stood that he has made things up whole cloth.
Right.
And I've always defended Pennsylvania Mountain Stories because he says the stories were what he heard. But if I remember correctly, something I was reading today about the story, Shoemaker claims to have found remnants of a French fort near where he says the story takes place. And again, I'm saying that's bunk. That's total bunk. There's just no historical evidence for that being. If there were a French fort, I have a hard time believing. But if there were, it probably wouldn't have been anything more than a blockade.
I was about to say, is it possible that whenever Shoemaker says fort, he really means like a blockhouse?
Well, that's what a lot of these forts were. I mean,
just
if you go to like Burning
already.
Cabins, PA,
right.
But there's just this was not a real. Yeah. This is him making stuff up.
Yeah, no, that's. I think you're probably right there. But I think it's interesting how when you have stories like this that come up, like a headless ghost, how there can be so many different interpretations of like the origin story, where you have an area that, like, again, let's say that there are people in fact seeing headless ghosts. You say, okay, well, was there anyone decapitated around here? What could could there be historical basis for that? And you can see how people put one and two together. So I do think that's an interesting kind of like wrinkle in this story.
One of the things I find interesting about it was reading that article. Again, 1950, there's an ecological angle to the haunting. And it makes me think if Cranmer modeled this story in that way, because again, I mentioned earlier, this is the brush heap era.
Right.
This entire region of the Commonwealth was clear cut. I've heard it described by people who lived through the tail end of it as looking like a lunar landscape. My dad's cabin was built in 1906. Okay? At that time, there was no forest. The forest was gone. And the brush heap era kind of defines this period of time, generally accepted to be from around World War I, well into the 1950s, where a lot of the towns in the region were at risk of burning down. A part of me wonders if this postmaster, in putting himself into the story, isn't telling this ecological tale that was informed in part by living through the brush heap era.
Right.
But I just thought it was a really interesting angle on it, because I don't know how many people were looking at the gas and oil situation in 1950. And we have to assume this is August of 1950. He's probably telling this story at least for a year. So look at going into the 40s.
Right. And again, like, you're right, because it's hard. Like, I don't know enough about the sociology of the time with that kind of stuff, because, like, I mean, like, from my perspective, there was a long time before when I thought that, like, environmentalism started with Rachel Carson and like Silent Spring, like that was the first.
And what was that? 1965.
Right. Yeah. Like, yeah, it was. Yeah. So it was considerably later. But obviously there were people who were quote unquote environmentalists or had those kind of influences in their storytelling. I just don't know if there was a name for it. But
Rachel Carson was 1962 with Silent Spring.
It's
kind of like the headless Lorax we're reading about here.
Well, kind of, yeah. And put yourself in Cranmer's shoes. Like, if you're telling these stories and everything and putting yourself into them and whatnot and trying to kind of like bring attention to the area. I mean, Lock Haven's not far, but it's certainly not close.
Yes, I would say I think it's about 40 miles by car.
Right. Yeah. It's not just over the hill, but like the fact that
I will confirm that.
Right. But like, so just the fact that like that his stories are being broadcast that far, that he is looking for kind of those outlets. you have to think there's some motivation in that. I mean, it seems like outside of writing this one book, it's not like he was making a ton of money off of these stories or anything necessarily. So I don't know what his motivation is, but I do like the idea that he did have kind of an ecological motivation for,
Yeah.
maybe not for the stories, but for bringing attention to the area. And also, again, if you love a place, you're going to tell the stories of it. So maybe in some ways he was, just a, kind of a cheerleader for this area and the people in it.
Well, coming back to you, I'm super happy to report. Do you remember how many miles I said it was?
You said about 40 miles.
It is 40.7 miles.
You know what? That's pretty darn good. That's
I am very pleased with myself right now.
I would have guessed more than that. So I'm glad you looked that up. So,
Yeah, from Road Hollow itself, which
really, it's only 40 miles. Okay.
yeah, it's basically you take 144
Yeah, like
to
east.
120. 120 is going to pop you right in Lock Haven. You'll come in right along the Susquehanna River, the west branch of the Susquehanna River, and you will pass Lock Haven University right before you get into the town proper. While in beautiful Lock Haven, you can visit the Piper Aviation Museum, where the Piper Cub was built, was Lock Haven, but also, and I've done this, so I can tell you, you can walk up a very hilly, like very steep cemetery, like really steep, and you can go to Shoemaker's grave because he is buried right there in Lock Haven.
That is something. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay. Look at this. Oh, so there is a
40 miles about,
There is a Hammersley
Bam,
Wild
I'm good.
area. Yeah, I haven't been over to that side.
The Hammersley Wilderness area, yeah, I've hiked through there quite a bit.
That's so cool.
It still has a lot of lumber in the region.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, and it remains a really desolate area. I mean, there's a town
Oh, there's nothing out there.
where the cabin is, and it's about 47 people.
I believe it. Yeah.
And it's just it
Yeah,
really,
there's stuff out there. Yeah.
Yeah, you when you look out and you're walking through the Hammersley, especially when you crest the hills and you can get to these
Right.
areas where a lot of the trees have been taken down by tornadoes and whatnot, you can look out, and it could be any century.